Good evening, and welcome back to the Sleep Library. Tonight, we journey to a place of quiet contemplation and gentle industry, where the rhythm of the seasons guided daily life, and the healing power of plants was both science and sacred art. We'll explore the monastery gardens of medieval Europe, those peaceful sanctuaries where monks and nuns cultivated not just herbs and vegetables, but knowledge itself. Behind the stone walls of abbeys and convents, away from the tumult of medieval life, religious communities created some of the most sophisticated gardens of their time. These were spaces where practical necessity met spiritual devotion, where the care of the body intertwined seamlessly with the care of the soul. Here, in plots carefully laid out according to ancient wisdom and patient observation, grew the medicines that would heal the sick, the herbs that would flavor simple meals, and the flowers that would adorn altars in praise of creation. Tonight, we'll walk these garden paths together, breathing in the scent of lavender and rosemary, listening to the gentle sound of water trickling through irrigation channels, and learning from the quiet wisdom of those who understood that to tend a garden was to participate in the divine work of creation itself. So settle in, make yourself comfortable, and let us begin this gentle journey through time to discover the serene world of medieval monastery gardens and the ancient art of herbalism. In the early morning light of a medieval monastery, as the bell tower chimed four lauds, the first prayers of the day, a different kind of devotion was already stirring to life. Beyond the stone corridors, where monks shuffled to chapel in their rough woolen robes, past the scriptorium, where manuscripts waited patiently for the day's careful copying, lay the gardens that would sustain both body and spirit throughout the long day ahead. The tradition of monastery gardens stretches back to the very beginnings of Christian monasticism, when St. Benedict wrote his rule in the 6th century, establishing the principles that would guide monastic life for centuries to come. He understood that a self-sufficient community did more than prayer and contemplation. Ora et labora, he counseled, pray and work. The garden became the perfect embodiment of this philosophy, a place where physical labor served spiritual purposes, where the tending of plants became a form of prayer in itself. The earliest Christian monks had learned much from their predecessors. Roman villa gardens, with their careful organization of useful and ornamental plants, provided practical models. But even more influential were the traditions of Egypt and the Eastern Mediterranean, where hermit monks had long sustained themselves through simple agriculture, finding in the patient cultivation of the earth a metaphor for the cultivation of the soul. As monasticism spread across Europe in the wake of the Roman Empire's decline, these garden traditions traveled with it. Each new foundation faced the same essential challenge: how to create, in often harsh and unfamiliar landscapes, the conditions necessary for a community to thrive. The solutions they developed were as varied as the climates and soils they encountered, but certain principles remained constant. The monastery garden was never conceived merely as a source of food or medicine, though it certainly served both purposes with remarkable efficiency. Rather, it was understood as a reflection of paradise itself, that perfect garden from which humanity had been expelled, but to which it might yet return through devotion and right living. This theological framework gave every aspect of garden work a spiritual dimension that elevated the most mundane tasks into acts of worship. Consider the morning ritual of the garden monk, often called the Herbalist, as he made his way through the waking monastery to begin his day's work. His first task was always the same: a careful survey of his domain, noting what had changed overnight, what needed immediate attention, what promised well for the season ahead. This daily inspection was more than practical necessity. It was an act of stewardship that reflected the monk's understanding of his role as caretaker of God's creation. The physical layout of monastery gardens reflected this spiritual foundation in tangible ways. Most followed a basic pattern that had evolved over centuries of practical experience. At the heart lay the cloister garth, the square of green space enclosed by the covered walkways where monks processed and meditated. This central garden was typically planted with grass and perhaps a single tree, often a symbol-rich choice like an apple or a fig, and served as a peaceful focal point visible from any parts of the monastery. Surrounding this contemplative core, the practical garden spread out in carefully planned sections. The kitchen garden, or hortus, provided vegetables and culinary herbs for the community's meals. The physic garden, or herbularius, contained the medicinal plants essential for the monastery's role as healer to the surrounding population. Often there was also a cemetery garden, where herbs and flowers grew among the graves of departed brothers, and sometimes a separate garden devoted entirely to flowers for altar decoration. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of these gardens was their role as repositories of knowledge. In an age when literacy was rare and books were precious beyond measure, the monastery garden served as a living library. Each plant represented centuries of accumulated wisdom about its properties, uses, and cultivation. The elderly monk who supervised the garden carried in his memory showed us the practical details of when to plant and harvest, but also the deeper knowledge of how each herb might serve in treating illness, preparing food, or creating the dyes and inks essential to monastic life. This knowledge was transmitted through a tradition that valued careful observation and patient experimentation. Young monks learned not from textbooks, though a few precious manuscripts might be consulted, but through seasons of working alongside their elders, watching, listening, and gradually absorbing the subtle skills that made the difference between a thriving garden and a failed one. They learned to read the weather in the behavior of plants, to diagnose plant diseases by the slightest changes in leaf color or growth pattern, to time their work by the phases of the moon and the feast days of the liturgical calendar. The tools of the monastery garden were simple but well crafted, often made by the monks themselves in the monastery workshops. Wooden spades and hoes, iron sickles and pruning knives, woven baskets and clay pots. Each implement was valued and maintained with the same care given to the chalices and altar vessels of the chapel. There was a spiritual logic to this. If all work was prayer, then the tools of work deserved the same reverence as the tools of worship. Water played a central role in monastery garden design, both practically and symbolically. The flowing streams that monks carefully channeled through their garden plots represented not only the irrigation necessary for plant growth, but also the living water of spiritual life. The sound of water trickling through carefully constructed channels provided a constant, soothing background to garden work, a reminder of the streams of paradise and the rivers that watered Eden. Seasonal rhythms governed every aspect of garden life with an intensity that modern people might find difficult to imagine. The monastery calendar, already rich with feast days and periods of fasting, prayer, and celebration, was further complicated by the demands of the agricultural year. Certain tasks could only be performed at specific times, not just the obvious ones like planting and harvesting, but also more subtle operations like the gathering of herbs at the precise moment when their healing properties were at their peak. The autumn preparation of the physic garden illustrates this seasonal sensitivity perfectly. As the growing season wound down and the first frosts threatened, the herbalist monk faced a complex schedule of harvesting, drying, and preserving that would determine the community's ability to heal the sick throughout the coming winter. Some roots had to be dug before the first freeze, others after. Some leaves were most potent just before flowering, others just after. Some seeds needed to be gathered at the moment of perfect ripeness, while others were better collected slightly underripe and allowed to finish maturing in storage. This intimate knowledge of timing extended to every aspect of garden management. The monks knew that certain vegetables transplanted better in the waning moon, that fruit trees pruned during specific feast days would bear more abundantly, that herbs gathered while still jeweled with morning dew retain their potency longer than those collected in the heat of midday. Such knowledge might seem like superstition to modern eyes, but much of it was based on careful observation of natural cycles that modern science has only recently begun to understand. The spiritual dimension of garden work was never far from consciousness. Each plant had its symbolic meaning, often derived from biblical references or the lives of saints. The lily recalled the Annunciation, the rose the Virgin Mary, the apple humanity's fall and redemption. But beyond these formal associations, the very act of gardening was understood as participation in the ongoing work of creation. To plant a seed was to cooperate with God in bringing new life into being. To tend a growing plant was to nurture one of God's creatures. To harvest the fruits of the earth was to receive a gift that required grateful acknowledgement. This theological framework gave even the most routine garden tasks a dimension of meaning that sustained the monks through long days of repetitive labor. Weeding became a metaphor for the spiritual discipline needed to root out vice from the soul. Pruning reminded the gardener of the divine pruning that shaped the faithful soul. The patient waiting required by all garden work, the weeks between planting and germination, the months between flowering and fruiting, became a school for the patience needed in spiritual growth. As night falls on our first day in the monastery garden, we can imagine the Herbalist making his final rounds, checking the irrigation channels, securing tools, noting tasks for tomorrow. The garden lies peaceful under the stars, its plants growing imperceptibly in the darkness, tended not just by human care, but by the same divine providence that numbers the hairs on every head and notes the fall of every sparrow. Tomorrow will bring new challenges and new gifts, as surely as the sun will rise to warm the earth and call forth new growth from the patient soil. As dawn breaks over the monastery walls, casting long shadows across the carefully ordered plots of herbs and vegetables, we begin to understand that nothing in these gardens was left to chance. Every path, every raised bed, every carefully positioned tree reflected centuries of accumulated wisdom about how to create order from chaos, how to transform raw earth into a reflection of divine harmony. The medieval monastery garden was laid out according to principles that combined practical necessity with profound spiritual symbolism. At its heart was the concept of the hortus conclusus, the enclosed garden, a direct reference to the biblical description of the beloved in the Song of Songs. A garden enclosed is my sister, my spouse. A spring shut up, a fountain sealed. This enclosure was more than mere protection from wandering animals or harsh weather. It represented the security and sanctity of the religious life itself, a space set apart from the world's confusion where true growth could occur. The typical monastery garden began with the cloister garth, that serene square of green space at the heart of the monastic complex. Here, surrounded by covered walkways where monks processed daily, reading and meditating, lay the symbolic center of the entire garden system. The cloister garth was usually planted simply, often just with grass and a single, carefully chosen tree. This tree, whether apple, fig, or bay laurel, served as more than decoration. It was a living symbol, its roots reaching deep into the earth, while its branches stretched toward heaven, embodying the monk's own aspiration to remain grounded in humility while growing toward divine contemplation. Around this contemplative core, the practical gardens spread outward in carefully planned sections, each serving specific functions while contributing to the harmony of the whole. The kitchen garden, or hortus, occupied the largest area, its rectangular beds arranged in orderly rows that made cultivation and harvesting efficient. But even this most utilitarian space followed aesthetic principles derived from both Roman agricultural treatises and Christian symbolism. The beds themselves were typically raised above the surrounding paths, creating a geometric pattern that could be appreciated from the upper windows of the monastery buildings. When viewed from above, as they often were by monks in the scriptorium or library, these raised beds created a living manuscript, their neat rows of vegetables and herbs forming lines of green text across the brown parchment of the earth. This visual metaphor was quite intentional. The garden was understood as another form of book, one that could be read by those who understood the language of growing things. Water features formed the organizing principle around which all else revolved. The monks were master hydraulic engineers, channeling streams and springs through their gardens with remarkable ingenuity. The main water source, whether natural spring, diverted stream, or carefully constructed well, was typically positioned at the highest point of the garden complex, allowing gravity to distribute water throughout the system. From this source, channels branched out like the veins of a leaf, carrying life-giving moisture to every corner of the cultivated space. These irrigation channels were marvels of medieval engineering, constructed with a precision that ensured even distribution while preventing erosion and waste. The channels themselves were often lined with stone or clay tiles, and their courses were planned to create the gentle, musical sound of flowing water that provided a constant background to garden work. At regular intervals, small pools or basins allowed gardeners to collect water for direct application to plants, while overflow systems prevented flooding during heavy rains. The sound of water was considered almost as important as its practical function. Medieval gardeners understood that the human spirit responded to certain natural sounds, the trickle of streams, the rustle of leaves, the hum of bees, in ways that promoted peace and contemplation. The careful design of water features was intended to create an acoustic environment that supported both the physical work of gardening and the spiritual work of prayer and meditation that accompanied it. Paths through the monastery garden followed principles that balanced practical access with symbolic meaning. The main paths typically formed a cross, with the intersection marking a significant point, perhaps a well, a statue, or simply a place where gardeners might pause for a brief prayer. These primary axes divided the garden into quarters, each dedicated to different types of plants or different seasons of cultivation. Secondary paths meandered more gently, following the natural contours of the land while providing access to every growing area. The materials used for path construction varied according to local resources and the wealth of the monastery, but all followed the principle that paths should be stable underfoot while allowing rainwater to drain freely. Gravel, crushed shells, brick dust, or simply packed earth provided surfaces that could bear the weight of wheelbarrows and garden tools, while remaining permeable to water. Along these paths, the monks often planted low-growing herbs, thyme, chamomile, pennyroyal, that would release their fragrance when lightly crushed underfoot, turning every walk through the garden into an aromatherapy experience. The borders and edges of garden beds received as much attention as their contents. Low hedges of box, lavender, or Sant'Elena define the boundaries between different growing areas while providing windbreaks for tender plants and habitats for beneficial insects. These living boundaries were maintained with the same precision given to illuminated manuscripts, their carefully clipped surfaces creating patterns that could be read as easily as written text. Within each section of the garden, the arrangement of plants followed both practical and aesthetic principles. Tall plants were positioned to provide shade and wind protection for smaller ones, creating microclimates that extended the growing season and improved yields. But the visual impact was equally important. Monks arranged their plantings to create pleasing combinations of color, texture, and form that would provide inspiration throughout the growing season. The physic garden, where medicinal herbs were grown, often followed a particularly sophisticated organizational system. Plants might be arranged according to their therapeutic properties. Digestive herbs in one section, respiratory remedies in another, wound-healing plants in a third. Alternatively, they might be organized according to the medieval understanding of the four humours, with cooling herbs to balance excess heat grouped together, warming plants to counteract cold, and so forth. Some monastery physic gardens were arranged to follow the human body itself, with herbs for head ailments planted at one end, those for foot problems at the other, and treatments for various organs arranged in anatomical order between them. Vertical elements added another dimension to monastery garden design. Trellises, arbors, and trained fruit trees created living architecture that served multiple purposes. Grapevines growing over pergolas provided shade for workers and guests, while producing fruit for the altar wine. Espaliered apple and pear trees maximized fruit production in limited space, while creating living wall decorations. Climbing roses and honeysuckle soften the harsh lines of stone walls, while attracting beneficial insects and filling the air with fragrance. The tool storage and work areas were integrated into the garden design with the same care given to more obviously decorative elements. Sheds and workshops were positioned to be convenient to the areas where their tools would be most needed, but they were also designed to harmonize with the overall aesthetic of the garden. Often built of the same stone as the monastery buildings, with roofs of thatch or tile that echoed the architectural style of the region. These functional structures became part of the garden's visual appeal rather than detracting from it. Composting areas, essential for maintaining soil fertility, were located downwind from the main monastery buildings, but positioned to make the transport of materials efficient. These areas were often enclosed by low walls or hedges that screened them from direct view, while allowing easy access for the constant additions of kitchen scraps, garden waste, and animal manure that fed the composting process. The monks understood that healthy soil was the foundation of a productive garden, and they devoted considerable attention to the alchemy that transformed waste into black gold. Seasonal considerations influenced every aspect of garden layout. Areas intended for early spring vegetables were positioned to catch the first warming rays of the sun, often on south-facing slopes protected from cold north winds. Summer crops were placed where they could benefit from morning sun but receive some protection from the intense heat of midday. Fall and winter vegetables were grown in locations that would be sheltered from the first frosts but still receive adequate light during the shortened days. The monastery garden also included spaces specifically designed for contemplation and prayer. Small alcoves furnished with simple stone seats provided places where monks could pause in their work for brief periods of meditation. These contemplation spaces were often positioned to take advantage of particularly beautiful views, perhaps overlooking a pond where water lily bloomed, or facing a hillside where fruit trees displayed their seasonal changes, or simply oriented to catch the light at specific times of day, when the quality of illumination was most conducive to prayer. Even the compost heaps and tool sheds were arranged according to principles that acknowledged their role in the overall harmony of the space. Nothing was hidden away or treated as merely utilitarian. Everything had its place in the grand design that made the monastery garden both efficient and beautiful. The result was a landscape that satisfied the practical needs of a self-sufficient community, while providing constant reminders of the divine order that the monks sought to emulate in their own lives. As evening approaches and the long shadows of the monastery walls begin to creep across the garden beds, we can appreciate how every element of this carefully planned space works together to create something greater than the sum of its parts. Tomorrow, as the bell rings for prime and the monks begin another day of prayer and work, this living architecture will continue its quiet contribution to the rhythm of monastic life, providing not just sustenance for the body, but nourishment for the soul. In the gentle light of early morning, as dew still clings to the broad leaves of cabbages and the earth releases the rich scent of fertile soil, we enter the heart of monastic self-sufficiency, the kitchen garden. Here, in neat rows that stretch across carefully prepared beds, grow the vegetables that will sustain the community through the turning seasons. Each plant chosen not merely for its nutritional value, but for its ability to thrive in the particular conditions of its monastery home. The kitchen garden represented the most practical aspect of monastery horticulture, yet it was approached with the same spiritual mindfulness that characterized every aspect of monastic life. The vegetables grown here were not luxury items, but necessities, foods that could feed a community through lean times, provide nutrition during long fasts, and offer variety to meals that were otherwise quite simple. Yet the cultivation of these humble plants was never considered mere drudgery. It was understood as participation in the divine work of creation, a daily act of faith in the providence that makes seeds sprout and plants grow. The layout of the kitchen garden followed principles developed over centuries of monastic experience. Long, narrow beds, typically 4 to 6 feet wide, were separated by paths wide enough for a monk to walk comfortably while carrying baskets or pushing a simple wheelbarrow. These beds were oriented north-south when possible, ensuring that plants received even sunlight throughout the day, and that the gardener could work from either side without throwing his shadow across the growing plants. Each bed was raised slightly above the surrounding paths, a technique that served multiple purposes. The raised construction improved drainage, preventing roots from rotting in waterlogged soil during wet seasons. It also made the soil easier to work, as the loose, composted earth of the beds could be cultivated with simple tools even when the paths were muddy. Perhaps most importantly, the raised beds created microclimates that allowed monks to extend the growing season, as the elevated soil warmed more quickly in spring and retained heat longer into autumn. The soil preparation that supported these productive gardens was a year-round endeavor that exemplified the monastic virtue of patience. Each autumn, after the final harvest, the beds were enriched with carefully composted materials, kitchen scraps, animal manure, fallen leaves, and the spent plants of the previous season. This organic matter was worked into the soil and then allowed to decompose slowly through the winter months, creating the rich, dark earth that would support the next year's crops. The monks understood soil as a living entity, not merely a growing medium, but a complex ecosystem that required careful tending. They observed how earthworms aerated the soil and mixed organic matter throughout its layers. They noticed how certain plants seemed to improve the soil while others depleted it. Long before the scientific understanding of nitrogen fixation, monastery gardeners had discovered that beans and peas left the soil more fertile than they found it, and they incorporated this knowledge into their rotation schemes. Crop rotation was practiced with mathematical precision, following patterns that had been refined through generations of observation and experimentation. A typical 4-year rotation might begin with heavy feeders like cabbage and other brassicas, which required rich soil and produced large harvests. The second year might see root vegetables like carrots and turnips, which could thrive in the somewhat depleted soil while helping to break up its structure with their deep taproots. The third year was often devoted to legumes, beans, peas, and lentils, which restored nitrogen to the soil while providing protein-rich foods for the monastery table. The fourth year might be given over to grains or allowed to rest entirely, supporting the soil's renewal while providing different crops for the community's needs. The vegetables grown in monastery gardens were chosen for their ability to store well, provide good nutrition, and thrive in the local climate. Cabbages formed the backbone of many monastic diets, as they could be harvested late in the season and stored in root cellars through much of the winter. When fresh vegetables became scarce, preserved cabbage in the form of sauerkraut provided essential vitamins and added flavor to otherwise monotonous meals. Onions and leeks were cultivated with particular care, as they served both culinary and medicinal purposes. Beyond their obvious role in flavoring food, these alliums were valued for their ability to ward off illness, a property that modern science has confirmed in their antimicrobial compounds. The monastery garden typically included several varieties of onions, large storage onions that could be braided and hung in cool, dry places 4 months, smaller, more delicate varieties for fresh use, and the hardy multiplying onions that produce new bulbs year after year without need for replanting. Root vegetables occupied a significant portion of the kitchen garden, as they could be stored in the monastery's root cellars and provided essential carbohydrates throughout the winter. Turnips, rutabagas, carrots, and parsnips were grown in carefully prepared beds, where the soil had been worked deeply to accommodate their long taproots. These humble vegetables might seem unremarkable today, but in medieval times they represented the difference between adequate nutrition and hunger during the long months when fresh food was scarce. The cultivation of beans and peas demonstrated the monastery garden's sophisticated understanding of plant relationships. These legumes were often grown-up supports made from hazel or willow poles, creating vertical growing space that maximized production in limited areas. The monks had observed that beans and peas seemed to benefit other plants grown nearby, and they often interplanted them with grains or vegetables that appeared to thrive in their company. Leafy greens provided fresh nutrition throughout the growing season and were often the first crops ready for harvest in early spring. Lettuce, spinach, chard, and various herbs could be succession planted, sown every few weeks throughout the growing season, to ensure a continuous supply of fresh leaves for the monastery table. These tender crops were often grown in the most protected parts of the kitchen garden, near walls or hedges that provided shelter from drying winds. The monastery garden also included plants that served multiple purposes beyond simple nutrition. Flax was grown not only for its nutritious seeds, but also for the fiber that could be processed into linen for the community's clothing and altar linens. Gourds produced containers that could be used for storing water, seeds, or other materials, while their young fruits provided food and their mature shells served utilitarian purposes throughout the monastery. Herbs occupied the borderlands between the kitchen garden and the physic garden, serving both culinary and medicinal purposes. Sage, thyme, rosemary, and other aromatic plants were grown in sunny, well-drained spots where their essential oils would be most concentrated. These herbs not only flavored the community's meals, but also served as preservatives, helping to keep stored food safe from spoilage and pest damage. The daily rhythm of kitchen garden work followed the liturgical hours, with specific tasks timed to coincide with the community's prayer schedule. Early morning, between Lord's and Prime, was ideal for harvesting tender vegetables, while they were still cool and crisp from the night's moisture. The heat of midday, when the community was often at prayer or engaged in intellectual work, was better suited to tasks that didn't require handling delicate plants, weeding, soil preparation, or tool maintenance. Pest management in the monastery kitchen garden relied on observation, prevention, and the use of companion plants rather than any chemical interventions. The monks noticed which plants seemed to repel harmful insects and which attracted beneficial predators. Marigolds were planted among tomatoes, not just for their cheerful flowers, but because their strong scent seemed to discourage many garden pests. The nasturtiums served as trap crops, attracting aphids and other insects away from more valuable vegetables. The harvest season brought intense activity to the kitchen garden, as the community worked together to bring in crops at their peak of quality and prepare them for storage. This was a time when the usual divisions between garden monks and other members of the community often broke down, as everyone contributed to the essential work of securing the year's food supply. Even elderly monks who could no longer handle heavy garden work might be found sitting in the shade, snapping beans or husking corn, while younger brothers carried baskets and worked the harvest rows. Food preservation techniques developed in monastery kitchens were often sophisticated, drawing on traditions from across the medieval world while adapting to local conditions and available resources. Vegetables might be dried, pickled, salted, or stored in root cellars under carefully controlled conditions. The timing of harvest for storage crops was critical. Too early, and the vegetables wouldn't keep well. Too late, and frost might damage them beyond use. The economic importance of the kitchen garden extended far beyond the monastery walls. Surplus production was often shared with the poor, fulfilling the Christian obligation of charity while building relationships with the surrounding community. Sometimes surplus vegetables were sold or traded, providing income that supported the monastery's other activities. The reputation of a monastery's gardens could enhance the community's standing in the region, attracting donations and recruits while demonstrating the prosperity that came from careful stewardship of the earth's resources. Seed saving was practiced with the same methodical care that characterized all aspects of monastery life. The best specimens of each crop were allowed to mature fully and produce seed, which was then carefully harvested, dried, and stored for the following year's planting. This practice ensured that the monastery's vegetable varieties became increasingly well adapted to local conditions over time, developing characteristics that made them more productive and resilient in their specific environment. The knowledge required to maintain a productive kitchen garden was passed down through generations of garden monks, creating a living tradition that combined practical experience with careful observation of natural phenomena. Young novices learned not only when and how to plant each crop, but also how to read the subtle signs that indicated the best timing for each operation. the soil temperature that signaled when it was safe to plant tender crops, the appearance of certain wild plants that indicated the right time for sowing grains, the behavior of insects and birds that suggested changes in weather patterns. As night falls over the kitchen garden and the day's work draws to a close, we can imagine the satisfaction of the monks as they survey rows of thriving vegetables, beds rich with the promise of abundant harvest, and paths worn smooth by centuries of patient labor. Tomorrow will bring new tasks, perhaps the transplanting of seedlings, the cultivation of growing crops, or the harvest of vegetables ready for the monastery table. But tonight, the garden rests under the stars, its plants growing silently in the darkness, sustained by the same providence that watches over all creation. In a quiet corner of the monastery grounds, often positioned near the infirmary where its treasures would be most needed, lies perhaps the most mysterious and wonderful of all monastic gardens, the physic garden, or herbularius. Here, in carefully tended beds that seem to shimmer with an almost otherworldly quality in the early morning light, grow the plants that hold within their leaves, roots, and flowers the power to heal human suffering. The monastery physic garden represented one of medieval Europe's most sophisticated medical institutions. Long before universities established schools of medicine, long before the great medical treatises of the Islamic world were translated into Latin, monastery gardens served as living laboratories where careful observation and patient experimentation advanced the healing arts. The monk who tended this special garden was often the community's primary medical practitioner, a figure whose knowledge combined classical learning with folk wisdom and direct experience in treating the ailments of both monastic and lay patients. The plants that grew in the physic garden had been selected through centuries of careful observation, their healing properties documented not in books, but in the living memory of the monastic community. Each plant represented a treasury of accumulated knowledge, not only what ailments it might treat, but precisely when it should be harvested for maximum potency, how it should be prepared for different uses, and what combinations with other herbs might enhance or modify its effects. The layout of the physic garden followed principles that reflected medieval understanding of both plant requirements and human anatomy. Often, the beds were arranged according to the parts of the body that different herbs were believed to benefit. Plants for treating headaches and mental disorders might be grouped together in one area, herbs for digestive ailments in another, and remedies for wounds and skin conditions in a third. This organizational system served both practical and pedagogical purposes, making it easier for the herbalist monk to locate needed plants, while also providing a visual reminder of the comprehensive nature of plant-based medicine. Some of the most important plants in the medieval physic garden were those we might consider ordinary today, their medicinal properties so well established that they had become essential components of monastery medicine. Chamomile, with its small daisy-like flowers and apple-sweet scent, was valued for its gentle ability to soothe digestive upsets, calm nervous conditions, and promote restful sleep. The monks knew to harvest chamomile flowers just as they reached full bloom, when their essential oil content was at its peak, and they had perfected techniques for drying the delicate blossoms without losing their therapeutic properties. Lavender occupied a place of honor in most monastery physic gardens, its tall spikes of purple flowers providing both visual beauty and powerful healing potential. The monks had discovered that lavender could serve as an antiseptic for wounds, a nervine to calm anxiety and promote sleep, and an aromatic that could help clear respiratory congestion. They harvested lavender at the perfect moment when the lower flowers on each spike were just beginning to fade, ensuring maximum oil content while capturing the plant at its most potent stage, sage, whose very name derives from the Latin solvere meaning to save, was considered so valuable that medieval herbalists often said, "Why should a man die who has sage in his garden?" The monks grew several varieties of sage, each with slightly different properties. Common garden sage was used for digestive issues and to strengthen memory, a particularly important consideration for monks who needed to memorize lengthy portions of scripture and liturgy. Clary sage was valued for eye complaints, while other species were employed for women's health issues and respiratory conditions. The monastery rose garden served both aesthetic and medicinal purposes, as roses were among the most versatile plants in the medieval pharmacopoeia. Rose petals were used to create waters and oils for treating skin conditions, while rose hips provided one of the few reliable sources of what we now know as vitamin C during the winter months when fresh fruits and vegetables were scarce. The monks had noticed that rose hips seemed particularly beneficial for those suffering from the bleeding gums and loose teeth that characterized scurvy. Though they understood this connection in terms of medieval humoral theory rather than modern nutritional science, rosemary, the herb of remembrance, was cultivated with particular reverence in monastery physic gardens. Its needle-like leaves and distinctive fragrance made it unmistakable, and its properties as a circulatory stimulant and memory enhancer made it invaluable for treating elderly monks whose minds had begun to wander. The plant's evergreen nature also gave it symbolic significance, representing the eternal nature of divine love and the persistence of memory beyond the grave. More dramatic in their effects were plants like comfrey, whose large, hairy leaves contained compounds that promoted rapid healing of broken bones and torn tissues. Medieval monks called it knitbone, and they prepared poultices from its fresh leaves to speed the mending of fractures and wounds. The plant's remarkable healing properties made it one of the most valued species in the physic garden, despite its somewhat coarse appearance compared to more obviously beautiful medicinal herbs. Foxglove presented one of the physic garden's most dangerous plants, its tall spires of purple flowers beautiful but deadly. The monks who grew it understood its power to affect the heart, both beneficially and fatally, and they used it only in the smallest doses and with the greatest caution. The cultivation of such potent plants required not only botanical knowledge, but also a deep understanding of dosage and preparation that could mean the difference between healing and harm. The harvest of medicinal plants required timing that was often precise to the hour. Many herbs were believed to be most potent when gathered at specific times of day or during particular phases of the moon. Roots were typically dug in the autumn when the plant's energy had returned to its underground portions, while flowers and leaves were usually harvested in the morning after the dew had dried, but before the heat of the day had driven off their volatile oils. Drying and storage techniques developed in monastery physic gardens represented some of the most sophisticated preservation methods of their time. Different plant parts required different approaches. Delicate flowers might be dried in thin layers on screens in shaded, well-ventilated areas, while tougher leaves could be bundled and hung from rafters. Roots were often chopped and dried slowly to prevent spoilage, while seeds were allowed to dry completely before being stored in sealed containers to prevent insect damage. The monastery still room, where dried herbs were processed into medicines, was often located adjacent to the physic garden for convenient access to fresh materials. Here, monks prepared tinctures by steeping herbs in wine or spirits, created salves by combining plant extracts with animal fats, and distilled aromatic waters using primitive but effective distillation apparatus. The processes used in these still rooms would have been recognizable to modern herbalists, as many fundamental principles of plant medicine have remained unchanged across the centuries. The preparation of plant medicines required not only botanical knowledge, but also skills that bordered on the alchemical. Monks learned to recognize the subtle signs that indicated when a tincture had reached proper strength, when an oil had extracted the maximum amount of plant material, or when a decoction had boiled long enough to concentrate its active principles without destroying them through excessive heat. These skills were passed down through generations of monastery herbalists, creating traditions of plant medicine that often proved more effective than the theoretical approaches taught in medieval universities. Record keeping in the physic garden was meticulous, though it often took forms that modern people might not immediately recognize as documentation. The knowledge was embedded in the garden's very layout, in the timing of cultivation practices tied to the liturgical calendar, and in the oral traditions passed from master to student. Some monasteries did maintain written herbals, precious manuscripts that documented plant properties and preparation methods, but even these formal records were supplemented by the vast store of practical knowledge that could only be transmitted through direct experience. The monastery physic garden also served as a center for medical education, though not in any formal sense. Visiting monks, local physicians, and even ordinary people seeking treatment might observe the garden's operations and learn from the herbalist monk's expertise. This informal sharing of knowledge helped to spread effective medical practices throughout medieval Europe, creating networks of plant-based healing that transcended religious and political boundaries. As evening approaches and the herbalist monk makes his final rounds through the physic garden, checking on plants that require special attention, gathering a few herbs that are best harvested in the cooler temperatures of dusk, we can sense the profound responsibility he carries. In his hands lie remedies that might save lives, ease suffering, or restore health to those who have nowhere else to turn. The knowledge he guards is both powerful and dangerous, requiring not only technical skill, but also the wisdom to use these gifts appropriately and the humility to recognize when even the most potent herbs cannot provide the healing that is needed. The monastery garden existed in constant dialogue with the turning of the seasons, its rhythm as predictable and sacred as the daily cycle of prayers that marked monastic life. Each season brought its own gifts and challenges, its own tasks and opportunities, creating a year-long cycle of growth, harvest, rest, and renewal that connected the community intimately with the natural world around them. Spring arrived differently each year, sometimes stealing in quietly during a warm February thaw, sometimes delayed until late April by lingering winter cold. But the garden monks knew how to read the subtle signs that announced the earth's awakening, the first swelling of buds on fruit trees, the emergence of early bulbs pushing through the last patches of snow, the changing angle of sunlight that signaled winter's loosening grip. These natural indicators mattered more than any calendar date, for the garden's needs were determined by actual conditions rather than arbitrary human measurements of time. The first spring task was always the same, a careful assessment of what had survived the winter and what needed to be renewed. The monks walked slowly through their dormant beds, examining the crowns of perennial herbs, checking the condition of fruit tree bark, testing soil drainage in areas that might have become waterlogged during spring thaws. This gentle inspection was both practical necessity and spiritual discipline, requiring patience, close attention, and acceptance of winter's inevitable losses. Soil preparation began as soon as the earth could be worked without damaging its structure. The monks had learned through long experience that working wet soil created hard clods that would hinder plant growth, throughout the growing season. They tested soil readiness by squeezing handfuls of earth. If it crumbled apart when pressed, it was ready. If it held together in a muddy mass, they waited longer, using the extra time for other essential tasks like tool sharpening and seed inventory. As the soil warmed and dried, the monks began the careful work of preparing their beds for the year's planting. Compost that had been aging through the winter was worked into the earth, along with aged manure from the monastery's animals. The rich, dark organic matter improved soil structure, provided nutrients for growing plants, and supported the countless soil organisms that the monks had learned were essential for healthy plant growth, even if they didn't understand the precise mechanisms involved. The earliest plantings took advantage of cool, moist spring conditions that favored certain crops. Peas and broad beans could tolerate light frosts, so they were often among the first seeds committed to the earth. These early legumes would mature before the heat of summer and would help fix nitrogen in the soil for later crops. Onion sets and garlic cloves, planted the previous fall, began showing green shoots that would develop into the year's allium harvest. Cool season vegetables followed in carefully timed succession. Lettuce, spinach, and other greens were sown every few weeks to ensure a continuous harvest throughout the spring and early summer. Radishes, with their quick maturation, were often planted between rows of slower growing crops, making efficient use of space while providing early fresh food for the monastery table. As spring progressed into early summer, the garden's activity intensified. Warm season crops, beans, squash, cucumbers, were planted only after all danger of frost had passed, their seeds or transplants protected from late cold snaps by makeshift shelters of woven reed or cloth. The monks had learned to watch for natural signs of warming, the emergence of certain wildflowers, the full leafing out of oak trees, the first appearance of specific insects that indicated stable warm weather had arrived. Summer brought both abundance and challenge to the monastery garden. The long, warm days supported vigorous plant growth, but they also brought increased demands for water, vigilance against pests, and the constant need for cultivation to control weeds. The early morning hours, before the heat became oppressive, were precious time for harvesting tender vegetables at their peak quality, gathering herbs while their essential oils were most concentrated, and completing tasks that required delicate handling of plants. The summer garden was a place of constant activity, with harvest, planting, and maintenance tasks overlapping in complex patterns. As early crops were harvested, their beds were immediately prepared for succession plantings that would provide food through autumn and into winter. This continuous cycling required careful planning and precise timing, as each crop had its own requirements for soil temperature, day length, and growing conditions. Pest management during the growing season relied heavily on prevention and observation. The monks learned to recognize the early signs of insect damage or plant disease, intervening quickly with techniques that ranged from hand-picking pests to introducing beneficial predators. They understood that a healthy garden ecosystem, with diverse plants and habitats for beneficial creatures, was more resistant to serious pest problems than monocultures or poorly maintained plots. Water management was crucial during the hot summer months, especially in regions where rainfall was unpredictable. The irrigation systems that the monks had so carefully constructed during garden planning now proved their worth, channeling precious water to thirsty plants with minimal waste. The timing of watering was as important as the quantity. Early morning irrigation gave plants moisture to sustain them through the heat of the day, while evening watering was avoided because it could encourage fungal diseases, The height of summer brought the first major harvests of the year. Herbs were cut and dried for winter use, their volatile oils most concentrated during the warm, dry days of midsummer. Vegetables were harvested at their peak, with timing that often required daily attention to catch crops at their moment of perfect ripeness. The community's preservation work intensified, as fresh abundance had to be converted into forms that would sustain the monastery through the leaner months ahead. Autumn arrived with its own unmistakable signals, the first cool nights that left dew heavy on spiderwebs, the changing angle of sunlight that cast longer shadows across the garden beds, the subtle shift in plant behavior as growth slowed and energy moved towards seed production. This was perhaps the most critical season in the monastery garden calendar, the time when the year's success or failure would be determined by the careful harvesting and preservation of crops. Root vegetables reached their peak quality in the cool days of early autumn, their starches concentrated by the plant's preparation for winter dormancy. Potatoes, turnips, carrots, and other storage crops were carefully harvested and stored in the monastery's root cellars, where cool temperatures and high humidity would preserve them through the winter months. The timing of this harvest was critical. Too early, and the roots wouldn't have reached their full size and nutritional value. Too late, and frost damage might ruin the entire crop. Late autumn brought the final garden tasks of the growing season. Tender annual plants were harvested completely before the first killing frost, while hardy perennials were cut back and mulched for winter protection. Compost piles were turned and new organic matter added, beginning the decomposition process that would create next year's soil amendments. Garden tools were cleaned, repaired, and stored away, their good condition essential for efficiency in the coming growing season. The dormant season was far from inactive in the monastery garden. This was the time for planning next year's plantings, for studying and copying precious horticultural manuscripts, for maintaining and improving the physical infrastructure of paths, beds, and irrigation systems. Seed catalogues might be consulted if they were available, but more often the monks relied on their own saved seeds and the informal networks of exchange that connected monasteries across the medieval world. Winter also provided time for the more contemplative aspects of garden work. The herbalist monk might spend long hours in the still room, processing the year's harvest of medicinal plants into tinctures, oils, and other preparations. The kitchen garden supervisor might plan crop rotations for the coming year, considering how to best use the land to maintain soil fertility while maximizing production. The monastery garden's seasonal rhythm created a deep connection between the community and the natural world that sustained them. Each season brought its own lessons. Spring taught hope and renewal. Summer demonstrated the rewards of careful preparation and diligent work. Autumn showed the importance of timely action and prudent storage. Winter provided rest and reflection that prepared the spirit for another cycle of growth. This cyclical understanding of time differed markedly from the linear progression that characterizes much of modern life. For the monastery gardeners, each year was not simply a unit of progress towards some distant goal, but a complete cycle of growth, maturity, harvest, and rest that contained its own intrinsic meaning and value. The garden taught patience with natural processes that could not be hurried, acceptance of seasonal limitations that could not be overcome, and gratitude for the abundance that came to those who worked in harmony with natural rhythms. As winter deepens and the garden lies quiet under its blanket of snow or autumn leaves, we can almost hear the silence that speaks of rest well earned and preparation for another year's abundance. The seeds saved from this year's harvest lie waiting in their storage containers, holding within their hard shells all the potential of next spring's garden. The perennial roots sleep beneath the frozen soil, gathering strength for another season of growth. And in the monastery's still room and storage areas, the preserved harvest of herbs, vegetables, and medicine stands ready to sustain the community through the quiet months until the earth awakens once again to the call of spring. In the quiet hours before dawn, when the monastery bells had not yet rung for the first prayers of the day, Brother Anselm took his way through the shadowy corridors toward the physic garden. His sandaled feet moved silently over stone floors, worn smooth by centuries of similar journeys, and in his weathered hands he carried the simple tools of his calling: a sharp knife for harvesting, a woven basket for gathering, and the accumulated wisdom of 40 years spent learning the secret language of plants. Brother Anselm was a herbalist, though that simple title barely conveyed the breadth of knowledge he had spent a lifetime acquiring. He was physician and pharmacist, botanist and chemist, counselor and spiritual guide. In his mind resided a vast library of plant lore that encompassed not only the healing properties of hundreds of species, but also their cultivation requirements, their seasonal variations, their interactions with one another, and their proper preparation for countless different ailments. This knowledge had not come from books, though Brother Anselm could read Latin well enough and had consulted the monastery's precious copy of Dioscorides when complex cases required deeper investigation. Rather, his expertise had grown like the plants themselves, slowly and organically, through seasons of careful observation, patient experimentation, and the gradual accumulation of experience that comes only from daily intimacy with the living world. The foundation of herbalist knowledge rested on the medieval understanding of the four humours: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. According to this ancient theory, inherited from Greek and Arabic medical traditions, all illness resulted from imbalances among these four basic substances. Each plant possessed its own humoral qualities, hot or cold, wet or dry, and effective treatment required matching the plant's qualities to the patient's particular imbalance. This theoretical framework, while foreign to modern medical thinking, provided medieval herbalists with a systematic approach to plant medicine that was both sophisticated and practical. A patient suffering from what we might now call a head cold, characterized by excessive phlegm and regarded as a cold, wet condition, would be treated with herbs that were classified as hot and dry. Sage, thyme, or rosemary might be prescribed. Their warming, drying qualities intended to counteract the cold, wet humour that was causing the symptoms. But Brother Anselm's knowledge went far beyond theoretical classifications. He understood plants as living beings with their own unique personalities and preferences. He knew that chamomile flowers were most potent when gathered on a clear, sunny morning just as the dew was beginning to evaporate. He recognized that comfrey root dug in the autumn contained healing compounds that were less concentrated in roots harvested at other times of the year. He could tell by the color and texture of dried herbs whether they had been properly processed and how long they might remain effective in storage. The herbalist's diagnostic skills were as important as his botanical knowledge. In an age before modern diagnostic tools, practitioners relied on careful observation of symptoms, attention to the patient's constitution and temperament, and detailed questioning about lifestyle, diet, and emotional state. Brother Anselm had learned to read the subtle signs that revealed the body's condition: the quality of the pulse, the color and texture of the tongue, the clarity of the eyes, the temperature and moisture of the skin. Each patient required individual attention, as the same symptoms might indicate different underlying imbalances in different people. A headache in a young, vigorous monk might call for cooling herbs to reduce excess heat, while similar pain in an elderly brother might require warming remedies to stimulate sluggish circulation. The herbalist's art lay in recognizing these subtle differences and selecting treatments that addressed not just symptoms, but underlying causes. The preparation of plant medicines was itself a complex art that required both technical skill and intuitive understanding. Simple teas, made by pouring hot water over dried herbs, were appropriate for some conditions, but many ailments required more sophisticated preparations. Tinctures, created by steeping herbs in wine or spirits for weeks or months, could extract and preserve plant compounds that water alone could not capture. Decoctions, made by boiling tough roots or bark, were needed to release the healing properties of harder plant materials. Salves and ointments required the herbalist to combine plant extracts with animal fats or oils, creating preparations that could be applied externally to treat wounds, rashes, or joint pain. The heating and mixing processes required careful attention to temperature and timing, as excessive heat could destroy delicate plant compounds, while insufficient processing might leave active ingredients locked within plant tissues. The monastery still room, where Brother Anselm prepared his medicines, was a place of quiet concentration, filled with the mingled aromas of drying herbs and the gentle sounds of bubbling decoctions. Shelves lined the walls, holding hundreds of jars and bottles containing dried plants arranged according to their properties and uses. Each container was carefully labeled, often with symbols or abbreviated Latin names that served as a shorthand for the herbalist's extensive mental catalogue. Distillation equipment allowed the creation of aromatic waters and essential oils, concentrated preparations that were particularly valued for their keeping qualities and potent effects. The process of distillation was both science and art, requiring careful attention to heat, timing, and the subtle changes in the distillate that indicated when the most valuable compounds were being extracted. The herbalist's knowledge extended beyond the cultivation and preparation of medicines to include deep understanding of how different plants interacted with one another and with the human body. Some combinations enhanced each other's effects, while others might produce dangerous interactions. Brother Anselm knew that certain herbs should never be given to pregnant women, that others required careful dosage to avoid toxicity, and that some patients might have individual sensitivities that required modified treatments. Record keeping was an essential part of the herbalist's practice, though it often took forms that modern practitioners might not immediately recognize. Some knowledge was recorded in written form, in carefully maintained journals that documented successful treatments, noted unusual plant behaviors, and preserved observations about seasonal variations in plant potency. But much of the herbalist's records were embedded in the garden itself, in the arrangement of beds that grouped plants according to their properties, in the timing of cultivation activities tied to the liturgical calendar, and in the oral traditions passed down through generations of monastery physicians. The herbalist also served as teacher and mentor, sharing knowledge with younger monks who showed aptitude for plant medicine and providing guidance to other monasteries that were developing their own physic gardens. This informal network of monastic herbalists created a system for sharing innovations, comparing treatments, and advancing the collective understanding of plant medicine throughout medieval Europe. The reputation of a skilled monastery herbalist often extended far beyond the religious community, attracting patients from the surrounding countryside who sought treatments unavailable elsewhere. Brother Anselm, who himself treating everything from simple cuts and bruises to complex chronic conditions, from the routine ailments of healthy young monks to the challenging medical needs of elderly members of the community. The ethical dimensions of the herbalist's calling had constant attention to the balance between helping and healing versus the recognition of limitations. Brother Anselm understood that not all conditions could be cured, that some patients would not respond to even the most carefully chosen treatments, and that the herbalist's role sometimes shifted from healer to comforter, providing palliative care that eased suffering even when cure was impossible. Prayer and spiritual counseling were integral parts of the herbalist's practice, reflecting the medieval understanding that physical and spiritual health were intimately connected. Brother Anselm often began treatment sessions with prayer, asking for divine guidance in diagnosis and treatment selection. He understood that anxiety, grief, and spiritual distress could manifest as physical symptoms, and that true healing often required attention to the patient's emotional and spiritual needs, as well as their bodily ailments. The seasonal nature of plant medicine meant that the herbalist's work varied dramatically throughout the year. Spring and summer brought fresh plants for immediate use and intensive harvesting for winter preparations. Autumn required careful processing and storage of the year's medicinal harvest. Winter provided time for study, preparation of complex remedies, and the treatment of patients with stored medicines. The herbalist's knowledge was both vast and specialized, encompassing not only the medical properties of plants, but also their cultivation, their symbolic and spiritual significance, their culinary uses, and their role in the broader ecosystem of the monastery garden. This holistic understanding reflected the medieval worldview that saw all creation as interconnected, with each element serving multiple purposes in the divine plan. As Brother Anselm completed his morning rounds through the physic garden, selecting the herbs needed for the day's treatments, checking on plants that required special attention, and mentally noting observations that would guide future cultivation decisions, he carried with him the accumulated wisdom of countless generations of healers who had found in plants the means to ease human suffering and restore health to those in need. The knowledge he possessed was both precious and fragile, dependent on the continuation of monastic traditions that preserved and transmitted plant wisdom across the centuries. In his careful tending of the physic garden, in his precise preparation of medicines, and in his patient teaching of younger monks, Brother Anselm served as a living link in an unbroken chain of healing that connected the medieval world to the ancient traditions of plant medicine that had served humanity since the beginning of recorded history. The monastery bell tower chimed softly in the pre-dawn darkness, its bronze voice calling the community to Lauds, the first formal prayer of the day. But in the physic garden, Brother Anselm was already at his morning devotions, kneeling among the lavender beds as he had done every day for more years than most of the younger monks had been alive. His weathered hands held not a prayer book, but a sprig of rosemary, and his whispered words of praise rose with the herb's sharp fragrance into the cool morning air. For Brother Anselm, as for countless monastery gardeners throughout medieval Europe, there was no separation between work and worship, between the cultivation of plants and the cultivation of the soul. The garden was his chapel, his laboratory, and his sanctuary all at once, a place where the most mundane tasks carried profound spiritual significance, and where every moment of labor was also a moment of prayer. The integration of garden work with the rhythm of monastic prayer created a unique form of spirituality that found the sacred in the midst of the everyday. As the bells called the community to each of the canonical hours, matins, lauds, prime, terce, sext, none, vespers, and compline, the garden monks paused in their work to join their voices with their brothers in praise. then returned to their plants with renewed sense of purpose and devotion. The day began, as all monastic days did, with lauds at dawn. But while most of the community gathered in the chapel, the garden monks often celebrated these morning prayers among their growing charges, finding in the awakening garden a natural cathedral whose vaulted roof was the sky itself, and whose pillars were the fruit trees just beginning to show their buds. The prayers of Lauds, with their themes of new beginnings and divine light, seemed particularly appropriate when offered surrounded by plants that were themselves responding to the first light of day. After the community's morning prayers, the garden monks began their first formal inspection of the day, moving slowly through the beds and noting what had changed overnight. This morning round was conducted with the same careful attention that a priest might give to examining the altar before Mass, checking that everything was in proper order, and that nothing had been damaged or displaced since the previous day's work. The tools of garden work were blessed and maintained with the same reverence shown to the chalices and vestments used in liturgical celebration. Each spade, hoe, and pruning knife was kept sharp and clean, stored in designated places, and handled with respect for both its practical function and its symbolic significance as an instrument of cooperation with divine creativity. The garden shed was arranged with the same orderly precision that characterized the monastery sacristy, everything in its proper place and ready for the day's sacred work. Water, the fundamental element that sustained all garden life, was treated with particular reverence. The morning ritual of checking irrigation channels and refilling containers was accompanied by quiet prayers of gratitude for the gift of life-giving moisture. Brother Anselm often began this daily task by dipping his fingers in the cool stream water and making the sign of the cross, a gesture that acknowledged both the practical necessity of water for plant growth and its deeper significance as a symbol of baptismal cleansing and spiritual renewal. The selection of plants for daily harvest was conducted with the same careful deliberation that a priest might use in choosing readings for the day's liturgy. Each herb gathered for medicinal use was examined closely, not only for its physical condition, but also for less tangible qualities that the experienced herbalist could sense but might find difficult to articulate. The timing of harvest was crucial, and Brother Anselm had learned to recognize the subtle signs that indicated when each plant was at its peak potency. The actual cutting of herbs was performed with reverent care, using sharp knives that would cause minimal damage to the parent plant while ensuring clean cuts that would heal quickly. Before making the first cut, Brother Anselm would often pause for a moment of silent prayer, asking for guidance in selecting the right amount of plant material and giving thanks for the healing properties contained within the humble leaves and stems he was about to gather. The preparation of medicines in the monastery still room was conducted with the same ceremonial precision that characterized the preparation of the Eucharist. Each step in the process, the measuring of herbs, the addition of solvents, the application of heat, the careful monitoring of extraction processes, was performed with complete attention and respect for the transformation taking place. Brother Anselm understood that he was participating in a kind of natural alchemy, helping to release and concentrate the healing properties that God had placed within plants for a human benefit. The rhythm of the canonical hours provided natural breaks in garden work that allowed the monks to step back from their immediate tasks and consider their labor within the broader context of the monastic vocation. At terce, the mid-morning prayer that traditionally marked the beginning of serious work, the garden monks would gather briefly to ask for divine blessing on their efforts and to remind themselves that their labor served not only practical but spiritual purposes. Sext, the midday prayer, often found the garden monks taking shelter from the sun's heat in whatever shade they could find, under fruit trees, in the shadow of walls, or in simple structures built specifically to provide relief during the hottest part of the day. This forced pause in physical labor created natural opportunities for contemplation, for quiet examination of the morning's work, and for peaceful preparation for the afternoon's tasks. The nun prayer, offered in mid-afternoon, was often the signal for the day's most demanding garden tasks. The heat had begun to diminish, making it more comfortable to work, while the remaining daylight was still sufficient for tasks that required good visibility. This was often when the heavy work of soil preparation, transplanting, or construction took place, activities that required sustained physical effort, but also provided opportunities for the kind of meditative repetition that many monks found conducive to prayer. Vespers, the evening prayer, marked the transition from active work to rest and reflection. In the garden, this was often the time for final harvests of the day, gathering vegetables and herbs that would be needed for the evening meal or for morning preparations. The gathering light of sunset added a quality of peaceful beauty to these closing tasks, and Brother Anselm often found that his most profound spiritual insights came during these quiet evening hours among the plants. Compline, the final prayer of the monastic day, was sometimes offered in the garden itself, especially during the summer months when the air remained warm and pleasant long after sunset. Standing among the beds where plants continued their invisible work of growth throughout the night, the monks found a natural sense of trust in divine providence that sustained all creation even when human effort ceased. The changing seasons brought variations to these daily rituals that reflected both practical necessities and spiritual themes. Spring garden prayers often focused on themes of resurrection and new life, echoing the resurrection theology central to Christian faith. The monks saw in every sprouting seed a reminder of the promise that life triumphs over death, that what appears dead and buried can rise again in glory. Summer prayers in the garden celebrated abundance and growth, but also included petitions for wisdom in stewardship and gratitude for the privilege of participating in creation's bounty. The monks understood that their role as gardeners made them partners with divine creativity, responsible for using their skills to maximize the gifts they had been given, while avoiding the pride that might lead them to claim credit for what was ultimately God's work. Autumn garden prayers carried themes of harvest and thanksgiving, but also of preparation and acceptance of natural cycles. The monks found in the garden's seasonal dying a spiritual metaphor for the human acceptance of mortality, learning from their plants how to let go gracefully while trusting in the promise of eventual renewal. Winter prayers in the dormant garden focused on rest, reflection, and the patient faith required to trust in spring's return. The stark beauty of the winter garden, with its bare branches and frost-covered beds, provided its own form of spiritual nourishment, teaching lessons about the value of dormancy and the strength that comes from deep roots and hidden growth. The community dimensions of garden prayer created bonds that extended beyond the immediate circle of garden monks to include the entire monastery and often the surrounding lay community as well. Visitors who came seeking healing from the monastery's herbalist were often invited to join in garden prayers, finding in the peaceful environment of the physic garden a setting that seemed to enhance the effectiveness of both prayer and medicine. The garden served as a natural classroom for teaching younger monks about the integration of work and prayer that was central to monastic spirituality. Novices working alongside experienced gardeners learned not only practical techniques, but also the spiritual disciplines that transformed ordinary labor into forms of worship. They observed how their elders began each task with brief prayer, worked with focused attention that was itself a form of meditation, and concluded their efforts with thanksgiving for both the privilege of useful work and the results that divine blessing had made possible. Special occasions in the liturgical calendar brought unique opportunities for garden-centered celebrations. The Feast of St. Fiocca, patron saint of gardeners, was often marked by special blessings of tools and plants. The celebration of Rogation Days, with their traditional focus on agricultural blessing, took on particular meaning in monastery communities where gardens provided essential food and medicine. The harvest festivals that marked the completion of major garden tasks became community celebrations that acknowledged both human effort and divine providence in the year's abundance. These occasions provided opportunities for the entire monastery to appreciate the work of the garden monks while recognizing their dependence on forces beyond human control for the success of their endeavors. As night settled over the monastery and Brother Anselm completed his evening rounds through the garden, pausing to whisper a final prayer of protection over the sleeping plants, the integration of work and worship that characterized monastic garden life reached its daily fulfillment. The plants would continue their silent work of growth throughout the night, sustained by the same divine power that watched over the sleeping community. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new opportunities for the sacred work that found in the tending of gardens a path to the tending of souls. As autumn's chill began to penetrate the early morning air and the first frost warnings appeared in the changing behavior of birds and insects, the monastery entered its most crucial season of preservation. The abundance of summer's harvest had to be transformed into forms that would sustain the community through the lean months ahead, when fresh vegetables were scarce and medicinal plants existed only in their dried and processed forms. Brother Marcus, the monastery's preservation specialist, rose even earlier than usual on this crisp October morning. His responsibilities during harvest season were immense, requiring not only technical skill in various preservation methods, but also careful judgment about timing, quality, and the quantities needed to carry the community through winter and into the next growing season. In the storage rooms beneath the monastery, shelves stood ready to receive the carefully preserved bounty of the garden, but only if the work of the next few weeks was completed with precision and care. The root cellar represented one of the monastery's most sophisticated preservation systems, a carefully engineered environment that maintained the precise conditions necessary for long-term storage of vegetables. Built partially underground to take advantage of the earth's natural insulating properties, the root cellar was positioned on the north side of the monastery complex, where temperatures remained most stable throughout the winter months. The cellar's construction reflected centuries of accumulated knowledge about food storage. Stone walls provided thermal mass that buffered temperature fluctuations, while carefully positioned vents allowed just enough air circulation to prevent rot without causing excessive drying. The floor was covered with layers of sand, sawdust, or dried leaves that could absorb excess moisture, while providing insulation for root vegetables stored in buried containers. Different vegetables required different storage conditions within the root cellar's microenvironments. Potatoes were stored in complete darkness to prevent the development of toxic compounds that formed when tubers were exposed to light. Carrots, parsnips, and turnips were buried in slightly moist sand that kept them crisp while preventing dehydration. Cabbages were hung from the ceiling rafters or stored in wooden boxes that allowed air circulation around each head. The timing of root vegetable harvest was critical to successful storage. Brother Marcus had learned through experience that vegetables harvested too early would shrivel in storage, while those left in the ground too long might suffer frost damage that would lead to rot. He watched weather patterns carefully, planning harvest schedules that would capture each crop at its peak storage quality while avoiding damage from unexpected temperature drops. The preparation of vegetables for root cellar storage required meticulous attention to detail. Each potato had to be examined for cuts or bruises that might provide entry points for decay organisms. Carrots needed their green tops removed to prevent moisture loss, but enough stem had to remain to avoid damage to the root itself. Onions required careful curing in warm, dry conditions before storage, their papery outer skins serving as natural preservation barriers. Herbs destined for medicinal use required completely different preservation techniques that would maintain their therapeutic properties throughout the storage period. Brother Marcus had spent years perfecting the art of herb drying, learning the subtle signs that indicated when each species had reached optimal moisture content for long-term storage without losing its potency. The monastery's drying rooms were marvels of medieval engineering, designed to provide the controlled conditions necessary for proper herb preservation. Adjustable wooden shutters allowed precise control of airflow, while south-facing windows captured solar heat without exposing delicate plant materials to direct sunlight that could destroy volatile compounds. Racks made from woven willow or hazel provided surfaces that allowed air circulation around drying herbs while supporting their weight without crushing delicate leaves or flowers. Different herbs required different drying approaches based on their physical characteristics and intended uses. Leafy herbs like sage and thyme were bundled in small groups and hung from rafters, their stems providing natural handles, while their loose arrangement allowed air circulation. Delicate flowers, like chamomile, were spread in thin layers on screens, turned regularly to ensure even drying without damaging their fragile petals. Roots required the most complex drying process, as their dense, moisture-rich tissues took much longer to dry than leaves or flowers. Brother Marcus would clean freshly dug roots, slice them into uniform pieces to speed drying, and arrange them on specially constructed racks that allowed air circulation on all surfaces. The drying process might take weeks, requiring daily attention to prevent mold, while ensuring complete moisture removal. The monastery's food preservation techniques extended beyond simple drying to include methods that would be recognizable to modern practitioners of traditional food arts. Fermentation played a crucial role in creating foods that would not only keep through winter, but also provide essential nutrients during the months when fresh vegetables were unavailable. Sauerkraut production began with the selection of the finest cabbages from the autumn harvest. Brother Marcus would choose heads that were firm, heavy, and free from any signs of damage or disease. The preparation process required precise attention to salt ratios and temperature control, as too little salt would fail to create proper preservation conditions, while too much would make the finished product unpalatable. The actual fermentation took place in large wooden barrels that had been carefully cleaned and seasoned for this purpose. Layers of shredded cabbage were alternated with measured amounts of salt, each layer pressed down to express moisture and remove air pockets that could harbor harmful bacteria. The filled barrels were covered with wooden lids weighted down with stones, creating anaerobic conditions that favored the beneficial lactic acid bacteria that would preserve the cabbage while creating the distinctive sour flavor that made sauerkraut both nutritious and appealing during the winter months. Other vegetables underwent similar fermentation processes that extended their storage life while enhancing their nutritional value. Turnips, carrots, and onions could all be preserved through careful fermentation, each requiring slight modifications in salt concentration and processing time. These fermented vegetables provided essential vitamins and minerals during the months when fresh produce was unavailable, helping to prevent the nutritional deficiencies that plagued many medieval communities. The monastery's approach to grain storage reflected the same attention to detail and understanding of natural preservation principles that characterized all their food storage systems. The harvest of grains from the monastery's fields required precise timing to capture the crop at optimal moisture content for storage. Grain harvested to wet would mold in storage, while grain left too long in the field might shatter and be lost to weather or birds. Threshing and winnowing were community activities that brought together monks from all areas of monastery life. The rhythmic beating of grain stalks with wooden flails created a percussion that could be heard throughout the monastery complex, a sound that spoke of abundance and security for the months ahead. The winnowing process, using broad baskets and the natural wind to separate grain from chaff, required skill developed over years of practice to achieve the clean, uniform results necessary for proper storage. The monastery granary was designed with the same sophisticated understanding of environmental control that characterized the root cellar and herb drying rooms. Thick stone walls provided insulation against temperature fluctuations, while elevated floors prevented moisture from seeping up from the ground. Wooden bins with tight-fitting lids created individual storage compartments that could be sealed against insects and rodents, while allowing access to specific quantities as needed. Pest control in grain storage relied on natural methods that reflected the monastery's deep understanding of ecological relationships. Certain aromatic herbs, stored in small bags among the grain containers, helped repel insects without contaminating the food. Cats were welcomed in storage areas where their presence helped control rodent populations. The timing of grain processing was carefully planned to break the life cycles of insects that might otherwise establish themselves in stored supplies. The preservation of fruits required yet another set of specialized techniques, as the high sugar and water content of most fruits made them particularly challenging to store without spoilage. The monastery orchard provided apples, pears, and other tree fruits that had to be processed quickly after harvest to capture their peak quality in preserved form. Apple preservation took several forms, each suited to different varieties and intended uses. The finest apples, those with thick skins and dense flesh that stored well naturally, were carefully wrapped in leaves or cloth and placed in wooden boxes, where they might keep 4 months in cool, humid conditions. Lesser quality apples were processed into various preserved forms that would provide sweetness and nutrition throughout the winter. The making of apple cider represented both a preservation technique and a form of alchemy that transformed fresh fruit into a beverage that could improve with age. Brother Marcus supervised the pressing of apples with the same attention to cleanliness and timing that he brought to all his preservation work. The wooden presses, operated by lever systems that could generate tremendous pressure, extracted every drop of juice from the fruit while avoiding the bitter compounds in seeds and stems. Fermentation of apple cider required understanding of the natural yeasts that lived on apple skins and in the monastery environment. The process had to be carefully controlled to produce the desired level of alcohol content while avoiding the development of vinegar or other unpalatable compounds. The finished cider was stored in wooden barrels in cool cellars where it would continue to develop flavor while remaining stable for extended periods. Drying represented another important fruit preservation method, particularly for grapes, which could be transformed into raisins that would keep almost indefinitely if properly processed. The monastery's grape arbors provided fruit that was carefully selected for drying, choosing clusters that were fully ripe but free from damage or disease. The drying process took place on reed mats in sunny, well-ventilated areas where the grapes would dehydrate slowly while developing the concentrated sweetness that made raisins valuable both as food and as offerings for religious ceremonies. The monastery's preservation of dairy products showcased another aspect of their sophisticated food storage systems. Fresh milk from the monastery's cows and goats was quickly processed into forms that would remain safe and nutritious for extended periods. Cheese making was a complex art that required precise control of temperature, acidity, and aging conditions to produce the various types of cheese that would provide protein throughout the winter months. The cheese making process began with the careful selection of milk, peak quality, testing for freshness and proper fat content that would yield the best results. The addition of rennet and starter cultures required timing that could not be hurried, as the chemical processes that transformed liquid milk into solid cheese occurred according to their own natural schedule. The pressing and aging of cheese required facilities that maintained specific temperature and humidity conditions, often in cellars or specially constructed aging rooms where the developing cheeses could be monitored and turned regularly. Salt played a crucial role in many preservation methods, serving both as a preservation agent and a flavor enhancer. The monastery maintained carefully controlled supplies of salt, understanding that its purity and grain size could affect the success of preservation projects. Different types of salt were used for different purposes. Fine salt for fermentation projects, where even distribution was crucial, coarser salt for curing meats, and fish where longer preservation times were needed. The coordination of all these preservation activities required careful planning and scheduling that took into account the varying harvest times of different crops, the capacity of storage facilities, and the labor requirements of different preservation methods. Brother Marcus maintained detailed records of storage quantities and quality, tracking which preservation methods worked best for specific crops and adjusting techniques based on experience and changing conditions. The monastery's preservation systems represented more than mere practical necessity. They embodied a spiritual understanding of stewardship that saw the careful use of resources as a form of worship. Nothing was wasted that could be preserved. Nothing was stored carelessly that might spoil through neglect. The abundance of summer was treated as a sacred trust that had to be protected and managed for the benefit of the entire community. As winter approached and the preservation work reached its completion, Brother Marcus could walk through the monastery's storage areas with satisfaction, knowing that the shelves lined with carefully preserved foods represented months of security for his community. The dried herbs hanging in fragrant bundles would provide medicine throughout the cold season. The root vegetables buried in sand would supply fresh nutrition when the gardens lay dormant. The fermented vegetables and preserved fruits would add variety and essential nutrients to winter meals. The preservation season also served as a time of community bonding, as monks from different specialties worked together to complete the massive task of processing the year's harvest. The kitchen monks contributed their knowledge of food preparation, the herbalists shared their understanding of drying and storage, and even the scholarly monks might find themselves pressed into service during the most intensive periods of preservation work. This annual cycle of preservation connected the monastery to the eternal rhythms of abundance and scarcity that had governed human communities since the beginning of agriculture. In their careful transformation of fresh harvest into stored wealth, the monks participated in humanity's ancient struggle against hunger and want. Using techniques perfected over centuries, to ensure that nature's bounty would sustain them through the lean months when the earth lay dormant beneath winter's grip. Adjacent to the monastery's infirmary, where the sick and elderly received care with the same devotion given to all monastic duties, lay perhaps the most specialized and carefully tended garden in the entire monastic complex. This was the infirmary garden, a quiet sanctuary designed specifically to serve the needs of those whose bodies required healing and whose spirits needed the particular comfort that comes from connection with the natural world. Brother Hildegard, the monastery's infirmarian, had spent 15 years perfecting this healing garden, learning through careful observation which plants provided not only medicinal benefits, but also the subtler gifts of peace, hope, and spiritual comfort that were often as important as any pharmaceutical remedy. Unlike the larger physic garden, where medicines were grown for general use, the infirmary garden was designed as a therapeutic environment where the very act of being present among growing things could contribute to the healing process. The layout of the infirmary garden reflected a deep understanding of how physical environment could support recovery and convalescence. Paths were wider than those in other garden areas, allowing patients who moved slowly or required assistance to walk comfortably among the beds. The surfaces were carefully maintained to prevent stumbling, with smooth stones for packed earth that provided stable footing even for those whose balance had been compromised by illness or age. Seating was positioned thoughtfully throughout the garden, creating places where patients could rest and contemplate the peaceful surroundings. Simple stone benches were placed to catch the morning sun, providing warmth for those whose circulation had been weakened by illness. Wooden seats with backs offered support for those who tired easily, while low walls around raised beds provided informal seating at heights that accommodated different levels of mobility. The plants chosen for the infirmary garden were selected as much for their sensory qualities as for their medicinal properties. Aromatic herbs like lavender and rosemary provided gentle fragrances that could lift the spirits and calm anxious minds. Their placement was carefully considered to take advantage of prevailing breezes that would carry their scents throughout the garden space without overwhelming sensitive patients who might be troubled by strong odors. Chamomile grew in patches where its apple-like fragrance would be released by the lightest touch, while its small daisy flowers provided visual reminders of simplicity and peace. The monks had observed that patients often found comfort in the gentle, undemanding beauty of chamomile's modest blooms, perhaps because they represented healing without ostentation, medicine without drama. The sound environment of the infirmary garden was as carefully managed as its visual and aromatic qualities. A small fountain or water feature provided the gentle, constant sound of flowing water that seemed to promote rest and contemplation. The water's movement was designed to be audible, but not intrusive, creating a natural sound masking that helped screen out the sometimes disturbing noises that might drift from other parts of the monastery complex. Plants that attracted songbirds were deliberately included in the infirmary garden design, as the monks had noticed that patients seemed to respond positively to birdsong. Berry-producing shrubs and seed-bearing flowers provided food that drew various species throughout the growing season, creating a natural symphony that changed with the seasons while providing constant gentle entertainment for those whose activities were limited by illness or recovery. The therapeutic uses of the infirmary garden extended beyond passive enjoyment to include gentle activities that could aid in rehabilitation and recovery. Patients who were strong enough were encouraged to participate in simple gardening tasks that provided mild exercise while creating a sense of purpose and accomplishment. The deadheading of flowers, the harvesting of herbs, or the light cultivation of soil offered opportunities for movement and engagement that supported both physical and emotional healing. Different areas of the infirmary garden were designed to serve specific types of patients and stages of recovery. A quiet corner with particularly comfortable seating and protection from wind might be designated for those in the early stages of recovery who tired easily and needed frequent rest. A sunnier area with more active gardening opportunities might serve those who were regaining strength and could benefit from gentle physical activity. The integration of the infirmary garden with the broader monastery healthcare system was seamless and thoughtful. Brother Hildegard worked closely with the herbalists to ensure that plants needed for specific treatments were readily available, while also coordinating with the kitchen monks to provide herbs that might make invalid food more appealing and digestible. Fresh herbs from the infirmary garden often found their way to the tables of recovering patients, adding both flavor and therapeutic compounds to their meals. The seasonal changes in the infirmary garden were managed to provide year-round interest and therapeutic benefits. Spring bulbs were planted to provide early color and hope after the long winter months, while evergreen plants ensured that even in the depths of winter, there would be life and growth visible to patients who might spend months in recovery. The careful succession of flowering plants meant that there was always something blooming to provide visual interest and natural beauty. The psychological impact of the infirmary garden was as important as its physical benefits. Patients who might feel isolated by illness found connection with the natural world that helped maintain their sense of participation in the larger community of life. The cycle of seasons visible in the garden provided reminders that their own periods of illness and recovery were part of natural rhythms that included both dormancy and renewal, darkness and light, weakness and strength. Pain management was one area where the infirmary garden played a particularly important role. The monks had observed that patients who spent time in the garden seemed to require less pain medication and reported better sleep quality. While they didn't understand the modern scientific explanations for these observations, the role of natural light in regulating circadian rhythms, the psychological benefits of nature exposure, or the physiological effects of pleasant sensory experiences, they incorporated these empirical findings into their treatment approaches. The garden also served as a place for spiritual healing, providing a natural cathedral where patients could pray, meditate, or simply sit in communion with creation. The monks understood that illness often brought spiritual as well as physical challenges, and they designed the infirmary garden to support both types of healing. Small shrines or statues might be positioned among the plants, creating focal points for prayer and reflection. The care of dying patients found particular support in the infirmary garden environment. The peaceful surroundings, the gentle sounds and fragrances, and the visible reminders of life's cycles provided comfort during the final stages of life. Families and friends could visit in a setting that felt more natural and less institutional than the infirmary building itself, while the garden's beauty helped transform final farewells from experiences of pure sorrow into occasions that included gratitude for life's gifts. Brother Hildegard's knowledge of therapeutic gardening extended to understanding how different patients responded to various aspects of the garden environment. Some found comfort in actively participating in plant care, while others preferred passive enjoyment of the garden's sensory offerings. Elderly patients often enjoyed sharing their own gardening knowledge and memories, finding in the garden connections to their life experiences outside the monastery walls. The maintenance of the infirmary garden had special considerations that differed from other garden areas. Plants had to be chosen not only for their therapeutic properties, but also for their safety around vulnerable patients. Poisonous or irritating species were avoided, while thorny plants were either excluded entirely or positioned where they wouldn't pose hazards to patients with limited mobility or impaired vision. The integration of the infirmary garden with the broader monastery garden system created opportunities for patients to participate in the larger community while accommodating their physical limitations. Harvest activities might be scaled to allow patients to contribute according to their abilities, while the processing of medicinal plants could provide meaningful work for those who were recovering but not yet ready for full physical labor. The educational aspects of the infirmary garden served both patients and visiting family members, as Brother Hildegard often used the garden setting to explain treatments and teach about medicinal plants. This educational component helped patients understand their care while providing them with knowledge they could use for self-care after their recovery. The garden became a classroom where healing knowledge was transmitted in a natural, non-threatening environment. Seasonal celebrations and rituals in the infirmary garden helped maintain patients' connection to the community's liturgical life even when they couldn't participate in formal religious services. The blessing of herbs on feast days, the gathering of flowers for altar decoration, or simple prayers offered among the growing plants helped ensure that physical separation didn't mean spiritual isolation. The reputation of the monastery's infirmary garden often extended beyond the religious community, attracting the attention of physicians and healers from surrounding areas who came to observe and learn from the therapeutic approaches developed there. This sharing of knowledge contributed to the broader development of healing practices throughout the region while establishing the monastery as a center of medical innovation and expertise. The records kept by Brother Hildegard documented not only the medicinal uses of various plants, but also their psychological and spiritual effects on different types of patients. These observations, while not systematic in the modern scientific sense, represented valuable accumulations of knowledge about the relationship between environment and healing that would be recognized and validated by contemporary research into therapeutic gardens and horticultural therapy. The infirmary garden represented the culmination of monastic understanding about the integration of physical, mental, and spiritual health. In creating an environment where healing could occur on multiple levels simultaneously, the monks demonstrated their sophisticated appreciation for the complex factors that contribute to human well-being. The garden served not just as a source of medicines, but as a healing space where the very act of being present among carefully tended plants could contribute to recovery and restoration. As the evening approached and Brother Hildegard made his final rounds through the infirmary garden, checking on patients who had chosen to remain outside, enjoying the gentle air, ensuring that seating areas were clean and comfortable for the next day's visitors. He embodied the monastic commitment to healing that saw care of the sick as a fundamental expression of Christian love. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new opportunities to use the garden's gifts in service of healing, continuing the ancient tradition that found in plants and peaceful spaces the means to restore both body and spirit to wholeness. As the evening light fades over the monastery walls and the last of the harvest has been gathered into storage, we arrive at the most profound aspect of the medieval monastery garden, its role as a vessel for preserving and transmitting knowledge across the generations. The seeds saved from this year's harvest carry within them not only the genetic material for next year's plants, but also the accumulated wisdom of countless gardeners who learned, experimented, and passed on their discoveries through the patient work of cultivation. Brother Thomas, now in his 70th year, moves slowly through the seed storage room where jars and boxes held the carefully dried and labeled seeds that would ensure the continuation of the monastery's gardening traditions. His gnarled hands, weathered by decades of garden work, handled each container with the reverence due to precious manuscripts, for these humble seeds contained knowledge that was just as valuable as any text in the monastery's library. The practice of seed saving represented one of the most fundamental aspects of monastic self-sufficiency and continuity. Each year, the garden monks selected the finest specimens from their crops, allowing these superior plants to mature fully and produce seed that would carry forward their best characteristics. This careful selection process, repeated generation after generation, gradually adapted the monastery's plant varieties to the specific conditions of soil, climate, and cultivation that characterized their particular location. The knowledge required for successful seed saving was complex and precise, encompassing understanding of plant reproduction, optimal harvest timing, proper drying and storage techniques, and the subtle art of selection that could improve varieties over time. Brother Thomas had spent decades learning to recognize the signs that indicated when seeds were ready for harvest, the changing color of seed pods, the brittleness of husks, the weight and appearance that indicated full maturity. Different types of plants required different seed-saving approaches. Annual vegetables like beans and peas were relatively straightforward, their seeds developing in pods that could be easily harvested and processed. But biennial plants like carrots and onions required patience, as they wouldn't produce seed until their second year of growth, demanding space and resources that might otherwise be used for food production. The storage of seeds required environmental controls that rivaled those used for preserving precious manuscripts or medicines. Moisture was the greatest enemy of seed viability, as excess humidity could trigger premature germination or promote the growth of molds that would destroy the stored genetic material. Brother Thomas had learned to test seed moisture content by feel and sound, recognizing the subtle differences that indicated whether seeds were sufficiently dry for a long-term storage. Temperature stability was equally important for maintaining seed viability over the months or years between harvest and planting. The monastery's seed storage areas were positioned in locations that remained cool and stable throughout the seasonal temperature variations, often in cellars or thick-walled buildings that provided natural insulation against weather extremes. The organization of seed storage reflected the same systematic approach that characterized all aspects of monastic life. Seeds were labeled with their variety, year of harvest, and source plant characteristics, creating records that allowed future gardeners to make informed decisions about which seeds to plant and which varieties to continue developing. This record-keeping system ensured that valuable genetic resources wouldn't be lost through confusion or oversight. The exchange of seeds between monasteries created networks of genetic diversity that strengthened the plant varieties available to each community while spreading successful adaptations across wide geographical areas. Brother Thomas maintained correspondence with garden monks at other monasteries, trading seeds and sharing information about cultivation techniques, pest management strategies, and successful plant breeding experiments. These seed exchanges often carried more than just genetic material. They also transmitted the accumulated knowledge and experience of other monastic communities. A packet of bean seeds might come with detailed instructions about optimal planting depth and spacing, while herb seeds might include information about harvest timing and medicinal preparation techniques that had been refined through generations of use. The preservation of plant varieties through seed saving served economic as well as agricultural purposes. Monastery gardens that developed particularly productive or well-adapted varieties could trade their surplus seeds for resources they needed, creating income streams that supported other monastery activities. The reputation of a monastery's garden varieties could enhance the community's standing in the broader region, while demonstrating the practical value of their horticultural expertise. The training of young monks in seed-saving techniques was recognized as essential for ensuring the continuity of monastic gardening traditions. Novices learned not only the mechanical aspects of seed collection and storage, but also the deeper principles of selection and breeding that could improve varieties over time. This education process might take years, as many aspects of seed saving could only be learned through direct experience with multiple growing seasons. The philosophical dimensions of seed saving resonated deeply with monastic spirituality, as the practice embodied fundamental Christian teachings about stewardship, patience, and faith in future abundance. The monk who saved seeds was exercising trust in divine providence, while accepting responsibility for preserving the gifts that had been entrusted to his care. This integration of practical work with spiritual meaning made seed saving a particularly appropriate activity for monastic communities. The manuscript traditions that preserved written knowledge about gardening and herbalism served as companions to the living libraries contained in saved seeds. The monastery's collection of horticultural texts, copied and illuminated by generations of scribes, documented cultivation techniques, medicinal properties, and garden design principles that complemented the practical knowledge embedded in plant varieties. These written records often included detailed observations about plant behavior, pest and disease problems, weather patterns, and successful experimental techniques that could guide future gardening decisions. The combination of written knowledge and living genetic resources created a comprehensive system for preserving and transmitting horticultural expertise across time. The influence of monastery gardens extended far beyond the walls of religious communities, as the plants and techniques developed in these settings gradually spread throughout medieval society. The superior varieties developed through careful selection, and the advanced cultivation methods perfected through generations of monastic gardening eventually enriched the agricultural practices of entire regions. The medicinal plant knowledge preserved in monastery gardens played a particularly important role in the development of European medicine. The careful documentation of plant properties and preparation methods, combined with the living preservation of medicinal species, created resources that would eventually contribute to the development of formal pharmacology and medical botany. The architectural and design principles developed in monastery gardens influenced secular garden design throughout the medieval period and beyond. The integration of practical and aesthetic considerations, the sophisticated water management systems, and the organizational principles that maximized both productivity and beauty became models that were adapted for use in castle gardens, town squares, and eventually private estates. The educational traditions established in monastery gardens contributed to the development of agricultural and horticultural knowledge throughout Europe. The networks of correspondence and seed exchange that connected monasteries created informal universities where practical knowledge could be shared and refined across vast geographical areas. The economic impact of monastery gardens extended through local and regional markets where surplus produce, medicinal preparations, and specialized plant varieties created income streams that supported not only the religious communities, but also the broader economic development of rural areas. The markets that grew up around successful monastery gardens often became centers of agricultural innovation and trade. The preservation of rare and unusual plant varieties in monastery gardens served conservation functions that are only fully appreciated from a modern perspective. Many plant species and varieties that might otherwise have been lost during the upheavals of medieval politics and warfare survived, because they were maintained in the protected environments of religious communities. The integration of gardening with other aspects of monastic life created models of sustainable living that demonstrated how human communities could thrive while maintaining harmony with natural systems. The monastery garden's emphasis on recycling organic matter, conserving water, and working with natural processes rather than against them provided examples of ecological wisdom that remain relevant today. The spiritual dimensions of gardening that were developed in monastic settings influenced broader cultural attitudes toward nature and agriculture. The understanding of gardening as a form of prayer and the integration of seasonal agricultural activities with liturgical celebrations created cultural frameworks that enriched the meaning of agricultural work throughout medieval society. The scholarly traditions that grew up around monastery gardens contributed to the development of botany, medicine, and agricultural science. The careful observation and documentation of plant behavior, the systematic experimentation with cultivation techniques, and the preservation of knowledge in both written and living forms laid foundations for the scientific revolution that would transform European understanding of the natural world. As Brother Thomas completed his evening inspection of the seed storage room, carefully checking the moisture levels in grain containers, noting which varieties needed to be tested for viability, and planning the seed exchanges that would bring new genetic diversity to next year's gardens, he embodied the continuous chain of knowledge and care that connected medieval monastery gardens to both their ancient predecessors and their distant successors. The seeds resting in their labeled containers would carry forward not only the potential for next year's harvest, but also the accumulated wisdom of generations of gardeners who had selected, saved, and shared their best varieties. In the spring, when these seeds were planted in carefully prepared soil, they would continue the eternal cycle of growth, harvest, and renewal that has sustained human communities since the beginning of agriculture. The monastery garden, with its integration of practical necessity and spiritual meaning, its combination of individual expertise and community cooperation, its balance of tradition and innovation, represents one of humanity's most successful models for sustainable living in harmony with natural systems. The knowledge preserved in these gardens, transmitted through both written records and living genetic resources, continues to inform modern understanding of ecology, sustainability, and the profound connections between human well-being and the health of the natural world. Tomorrow, as the bells ring for the first prayers of a new day, the monastery garden will continue its quiet work of preserving and transmitting the knowledge that connects us to the earth that sustains all life. In its peaceful beds, where seeds sleep through the winter months gathering strength for spring's renewal, lies the promise that the ancient wisdom of those who learn to find the sacred in the everyday work of tending growing things will continue to nourish both body and spirit for generations yet to come. As our journey through the medieval monastery garden draws to a close, we find ourselves enriched by the quiet wisdom of those who understood that true abundance comes not from taking more than we need, but from giving careful attention to what we have been given. In the patient work of these garden monks, we discover a way of living that honored both the practical necessity of feeding the body and the spiritual hunger that seeks meaning in everyday tasks. The monastery garden was never just a place where plants grew. It was a school where human souls learned the virtues of patience, humility, and trust in providence. It was a library where knowledge was preserved in living form a laboratory where careful observation advanced the healing arts, and a sanctuary where the sacred could be encountered in the simplest acts of planting, tending, and harvesting. Tonight, as we prepare for sleep, we can imagine the monastery garden resting under starlight, its plants growing silently in the darkness, sustained by the same mysterious forces that turn seeds into flowers, that change seasons in their proper time, and that teach us, if we have eyes to see, that we too are part of the great community of life that finds its ultimate source in the love that moves the sun and stars. Sleep well, and may your dreams be filled with the peace of gardens, where all growth occurs according to its proper season, where patient tending yields abundant harvest, and where the work of human hands joins with divine grace to create beauty, healing, and nourishment for all who are in need. Good night.